Welcome to Nerds at Church, a queer feminist podcast diving deep into faith, nerdery, and the Bible. I'm Pastor Emily, and I use pronouns like they, them, theirs.
And I'm Pastor Kay, and my pronouns are she, her. In this episode, we're descending into our villain era.
Dun dun dun!
Today we have biblical, historical, and pop culture villains for you. So, speaking of the biblical villains, the story of Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 that we'll be discussing comes up in the lectionary on Proper 5 in Year B, which was this year the third Sunday after Pentecost. And in our first season, 4 years ago, when we first talked about that Sunday, it was the second Sunday after Pentecost.
3 years ago.
Depending on how you want to do the math, sure. And so my point is that as for the numbering of the Sundays, blame that on the Episcopalians. It's not our fault. But we can totally point you at the right episode to listen to if you want to listen to us talk about that Bible passage in a different context.
Indeed we will.
And we will link to that past episode in our episode description.
Yes. If you are as excited about this season and these episodes as we are, and this podcast in general, you can become a Patreon supporter for more content at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch, and check out the episode description for links to any references we make in this episode, including our book list for this season. So, as we descend into this villain era of ours, we are thinking about what it means to do bad stuff for good causes. And this comes into play for all of our villains in different capacities, but also as Lutherans, Kay and I are especially familiar with the idea that we are to sin boldly, which is a Martin Luther phrase, and it comes from the idea of sin boldly, but believe in Christ even more boldly. So it's connected to the idea that, like, no matter what, we're human and we're going to mess up. We're going to cause harm. That's part of what it is to be human, because we are not perfect. And also, because of that, and because we know, as Desmond Tutu stated, that there is nothing we can do to make God love us any more, and there is nothing we can do to make God love us any less, then we are freed and empowered to be bold in our actions and risk that they might be sinful for the sake of the gospel.
Sure.
So one of the people that comes up a lot in this kind of genre of conversation is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was part of a plot to assassinate Hitler and ended up dying in a concentration camp during World War II and the Holocaust. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer has his own issues, particularly with anti-Semitism, but one of the things that he is really well known for is that he resisted Nazis and Nazism in Germany in World War II and leading up to it, and that he actively fought against it, including in ways that some people deem sinful or bad, and other people deem necessary. And so this is kind of like where deontology, which is the idea that the way you get to your goal matters, and teleology, which is the goal is the thing that matters and the way you get to it is less important, kind of clash. Because this definitely lands more on the side of teleology, of your goal is good, so however you can get to that goal, go for it.
Which is definitely not where Bonhoeffer himself was, because he wrote fairly extensively on how difficult making that decision to join that plot to assassinate Hitler was for him, and how it really was the very last option he had available to him that he felt would actually be effective. It was a very difficult decision for him, and we as a podcast would just like to continue saying that murder is bad. Don't.
Indeed, indeed. Murder is bad, genocide is worse, because it's murder on a large scale. Yes. But that's kind of what we're digging into, that we have set up in the world and in pop culture certain people to be heroes and certain people to be villains, and how we decide who is hero and who is villain a lot of the times has to do more with who has power or who has capital in a capitalist society, or who has kind of the capabilities and the narrative around them to be deemed hero versus those who are deemed villain. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm excited to dive into it. I'm excited for our villain era.
Yes. So for our first set of villains, because we're going to have multiple sets of villains today, there are no singular individual villains. These are all multiple people. For our pop culture villains, we have Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze from the Batman universe. And many of you may already be familiar with them from different sources. So I'll give a short summary for each of them. Poison Ivy, whose legal name is Pamela Isley, first appeared in Batman issue number 181 in 1966 as part of an ongoing effort then to have more female characters in Batman's world in general. That's also when Batgirl and a few other characters made their appearances too.
Weird. It's kind of like having a male superhero and male villains doesn't lead to a lot of gender diversity.
Yeah. Or, having more gender diversity makes for more interesting stories. And they were figuring that out in the 60s already. So it has been a while, and yet.
And yet.
And so there are many continuities for Poison Ivy and for all comic book characters, really, at this point. But she pretty much always starts off as a botanist who gains superpowers, generally through some kind of a lab accident. And she becomes something of an avatar of nature with these superpowers that she gains. And she fights back against humanity's destruction of the planet in a variety of ways. As time has gone on and our impact on the planet's ecosystem has become more and more and more obvious, writers have had to have her lean more into full-on human genocide and, destroying the human species as a whole to keep her as a supervillain and not as an anti-heroine, because it turns out that the environment is something that we need to work on and that we are actively destroying and are having a hand in our own destruction with. And
Weird.
So they've had to have her lean into further and further severe plots in order to make sure that she doesn't sound too much like a hero, although she does walk the line in a few places. She appeared in multiple incarnations, but I personally know her best from the 1997 film Batman and Robin, where she is played by Uma Thurman. I think that was my first introduction to her. And, of course, there is also the current adult animated series, Harley Quinn, where she is the love interest and best friend, and also general mastermind. Like, no one wants Harley to plan anything. That's a terrible idea. But Poison Ivy's pretty good at it.
2 people in our family went as Poison Ivy and Harley Quinn for Halloween last year.
Aw.
So.
Yes, that series is very fun. And then Mr. Freeze started off as Mr. Ice in Batman issue number 121 in 1959, and he was later renamed Mr. Freeze in 1966. And at that point, he did not have much of a backstory or even a legal name until 1992, when he was reinvented by comic book author Paul Dini as a tragic character known as Dr. Victor Freeze, F-R-I-E-S, pronounced Freeze, who, in trying to save his wife from a rare disease, has a lab accident that gives him superpowers and also confined him to life in a cryosuit in order to survive. And he becomes a supervillain because various people are not as cooperative in saving his wife's life as he would like for various reasons.
That's true.
Again, also, he appeared in 1997's Batman and Robin as played by Arnold Schwarzenegger, which he was clearly having a very good time. And he also does more briefly appear in the cartoon Harley Quinn, where he, much to her surprise, teaches Harley what real love actually looks like when he is genuinely willing to die to save his wife. Things kind of go a little haywire after that, but we don't need to go there because he's dead. So,
yeah. I think it's particularly interesting because there's in psychology, there was always that one scenario of, the person, usually a man, who steals medicine in order to save his dying wife or kid, and...
Oh, yes, the medical ethics question. A life is saved, a window's broken. As I think Dr. Bartlett puts it in an episode of West Wing at one point.
Yep. And that is used in psychology, I think, to, establish where people are at in their psychological development and moral and ethical development, which I think is fascinating.
Having a more complicated set of ethical understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he's, living it out.
I mean... On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, depending on which continuity we're talking about, he kills a lot of people. A lot of whom have nothing to do with his wife. So, and also causes a truly amazing amount of property damage that probably impacts a lot of people's jobs and abilities to earn their livings, and very possibly also their homes. So, yeah.
Yeah. Less concerned about the property damage, but killing other people to save one person. Yeah, that's tricky.
Yeah. So as far as what they're known for, both of these guys are obviously villains who are mostly trying to not do bad things, which is an interesting take for villains. Also, as you'll notice with a lot of comic book characters who have what's called a rogues gallery, it's a sort of a trope for a certain type of villain because you need to have bad guys for the hero to fight against, but you don't want the bad guys to be too terrible or else you don't want to see them again. And so... you wind up with this interesting middle ground of a rogues gallery of people who are, trying to do good things, but also, taking the absolute terrible decision-making route of you really shouldn't go there. So that happens pretty consistently for Batman and for a lot of other characters. I think another character known for that is the Flash and some of the others. So, yeah, saving the planet or saving one's spouse are good things, in general, absolutely. But also after some lab accidents and misunderstandings and occasionally the cis-heteropatriarchy getting in the way, which I think very clearly happens with Uma Thurman's Poison Ivy and Batman and Robin. And I'm not entirely sure I'm remembering this right, but I think also in a more general sense with Mr. Freeze's issues in that same movie, people who are somewhat misogynistic towards his wife and the importance of her survival during that movie. Because of those things, they abandon things like, say, the Fifth Commandment and the survival of the human species in order to get their way.
Just kind of.
And some of these things are important.
I mean...
So, yeah.
I go back and forth on whether or not humans should survive, but yeah, totally.
Sure, but, the Fifth Commandment also comes in there. And
that's true.
And so, what do we love about them? I, personally am generally in favor of dedication to a good cause, and I'm also in favor of picking an aesthetic you like and just absolutely going for it without apology, and both of these guys do that to the nines, absolutely. But, supervillainhood is probably something you need to avoid, if only because, while the evil cackling laughter is pretty hilarious, the plans you actually wind up making are usually pretty bad. From having watched the movies and the TV shows and read the comics and so forth, so...
It's true. I particularly love, and I have not seen Harley Quinn, though I have been told that I should watch it multiple times, and I will eventually watch it.
You absolutely should, yes. You will love it.
Yeah, it sounds great, but part of why I wanted Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze is just the iconic type understanding of Poison Ivy being very much Earth, and you talked about this when you were describing her, right? They have had to do work to make her still a supervillain and not an anti-heroine, because the Earth does resist, right? And what does it look like for the Earth to fight back? And we just recorded our movie commentary on Pacific Rim, and so that understanding of the kaiju as the Earth fighting back.
Well, not in that particular movie, but in many other kaiju movies, yes.
Not in that, but the idea of kaiju fighting back.
Yes.
Which we talked about also in another strand because of Godzilla and Horror Nerds at Church.
Because Godzilla movies that involve a guy wandering around in a rubber suit are the best Godzilla movies. But that's a whole different conversation we'll have another day.
Totally. But this idea that, while we are facing massive deforestation and destruction of the environment and creation, and also increasing temperatures on the Earth, Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze seem... pretty well placed for that.
Yeah, there are some places on the planet we could send Mr. Freeze and he could do a lot of good right now. I'm just saying.
And then also, and what we didn't talk about is so often Batman is portrayed as the hero, right? Classically, Batman is a classic hero.
Right. And more recently, speaking of changing how we tell stories about people, he has become more on the side of, let's just break all of the laws and destroy people's privacy and beat people up when there is no legal reason to do so. Because there's not much that technology can do now that only the rich people have access to, comparatively.
Yeah. And he is rich, right? He is a millionaire whose parents made the money that they made because of exploitation of labor, right?
Yeah.
Like, we talk about this currently, right? Billionaires could not be billionaires if they were not exploiting labor, if they were not exploiting workers. Yeah. Right? You have to exploit people in order to become a billionaire because it is that much money.
Yeah. Just ask Dolly Parton. That's why she's not one, because she keeps giving back. And she also doesn't exploit people.
Yeah. And so when we think about Batman as the classic hero, also, because we're in the villain era, what does it look like to actually think about Batman as potentially being the villain? What does it look like to say the millionaire who gets to play with all the fancy gadgets and gizmos and has a butler? Literally has a butler who takes care of him and does all the things and helps him do his little vigilante shtick.
I mean, Alfred is amazing.
Alfred is amazing. I'm not knocking
also,
Alfred.
If we all had Alfreds, the entire world would be a terrifying place. But yes.
Right. Or even if we were all Alfreds, right?
I think a lot of us would have to be more capable and competent than we are, Emily. Like, I am not an Alfred. That is not happening.
I'm not saying you are. I'm just saying, what if we were? But Bruce Wayne is not Alfred, right? And what does it look like to think about Bruce Wayne critically instead of just the automatic assumption?
You are going to love the series Harley Quinn so much I cannot even begin to tell you. But
I'm excited for it. I am still trying to work my way through Doctor Who, but also am watching like a Discovery of Witches because Horror Nerds at Church is starting our witchy season. But also, Harley Quinn and all sorts of different shows are like on right now. I don't know how I'm going to keep up. I probably won't, but we'll try anyway. Yeah, so that's some of the stuff that I love about Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze, and in thinking more critically about Bruce Wayne and Batman.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And as for a tie-in to today's theme, they are trying to do good things, and they are choosing terrible ways to do it. And also, our sub-theme today is saving the environment, and Poison Ivy is definitely all about that. And Mr. Freeze actually has to learn a lot about the environment as part of his powers involve, adapting it. And he does make some comments, I think, in various continuities about how the destruction of the environment is impacting his ability to use his powers. So
interesting.
Yeah. And then as for media, besides the Batman and Robin movie from 1997, of course, there is also the Harley Quinn animated TV show that's going currently. There is the 1966 Batman TV series with Adam West, which is a ton of fun and just delightful. Completely different. If you want a Batman you can actually like, watch that TV show. He is adorable. And also a lot of the really old jokes about Batman originated there. There's the Gotham TV show, which I have not actually tried. Poison Ivy, in particular, appears in the Arrowverse collection of TV shows and has had a few solo comic book series. And Mr. Freeze appears in several comic book crossovers, including one with Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which kind of surprised me. And he and his wife Nora also have a comic that tells their love story, which is called Victor and Nora, A Gotham Love Story. And I don't think he has like any comic book series that are solo dedicated to him, but he does have that one book. And then, of course, there are countless comic book issues and video game appearances for both of them in addition to that, which I could not even begin to list.
There's a TV series that I'm trying to remember. It was a show when I was younger, like maybe a teenager or a young adult, and it was 3 women who were heroes taking care of the city, and one of them was a wheelchair user, but it was like in the Batman type verse.
There are a bunch of different Batman continuities where Barbara Gordon is in a wheelchair, and she is variously Batgirl and or like her dad, Commissioner Gordon's second and or heir, basically.
It was not animated. It was really good because it was 3 women, I think they were maybe sisters, and they protected stuff, but I really liked it because there was a lot more diversity in it, particularly with ability, where one person was in a wheelchair.
Sure.
Our second supporting villains are Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve and Steve get a bad rap because it is attributed to them, especially attributed to Eve. The whole like knowledge of the tree of good and evil and banishment from Eden and all of that is attributed primarily in Christianity to Eve, but in general, also to Adam and Eve. So we're going to dig into them a little bit. And the basic info. So the original human that was created in the Garden of Eden, which is the creation story that begins with the second half of Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. So Genesis chapter 2, verse 4b. Mm-hmm. And the first human is called Adam. And it's a pun, because we like puns here on Nerds at Church.
And presumably the biblical authors did too.
Yes. And Adam is a Hebrew word, as is Adamah. So Adamah is earth. So you get Adam from Adamah, which would kind of be like an earthling from earth or a human from hummus, right? It's that sort of a play on the word. And you get this intersex, gender, who knows, human. And this human is born in the Garden of Eden. And God gets to know the human a bit and is like, you know, I should not make you by yourself. I should give you a companion. And God, like, tries to provide non-human companions to the human, and it doesn't work. I'm not sure that dogs were around then, or, okay, probably you think cats. Because then it might have worked then. Have a bunch of, like, childless cat ladies running around, which we love.
Because we totally don't.
Yeah, also true. And ultimately, God's like, okay, none of these more than human creatures are matching up well with this human. So God puts the human to sleep, takes out a rib from the human, so from the core of who the human is. And I've heard pastors talk about it as like they took the rib and not the head because they wouldn't be superior, not the foot because they wouldn't be inferior, but the rib because they would be intimate and surrounded and supportive and partners. And so they take this rib, and from this rib, they create Isha. And that is the point in the Hebrew where Adam shifts into Ish and Isha. Isha being from Ish. And that's where the English Adam or Adam and Eve kind of come into being.
Sure.
Come into play in the story.
I have heard so many terrible misogynistic jokes about Adam's rib. Can I tell you about a good one that is not misogynistic and was actually very sweet that I heard recently?
Ooh, yes, always.
Because it was such a genre-breaking moment for me.
Yeah.
So recently, there is a person who is attached to my congregation, and he had been having some trouble, and his doctors finally figured out what was going on because it turns out he has an unusual condition. The top rib on one side, I think it might be the left, I don't honestly know, but the top rib and the collarbone, when you lift your arm, they often rub up against each other. And
okay, yeah.
And every so often, a person is born who, most of your arteries and veins and such go inside of your ribs, right? Like, because they stay inside the inner part of your body for safety. But every so often, someone will be born, and like one of the veins or arteries will loop around outside of the rib instead of inside.
Ooh.
And so then if you raise your arm to a certain level, the artery or vein, it'll interrupt the blood flow. And that can be a problem for various reasons. And if you happen to also be the type of person who sleeps with your arms above your head, that can lead to some ongoing problems. And so they finally figured out what was going on, which is the good news. And they looked at all the various options of what they could do, and apparently the option they came up with that was going to cause the least amount of trouble. I'm not telling you this person's name, so you'll never be able to track this person down, which is why I can tell this story. But the option that would cause the least amount of trouble is to simply remove the rib, right? Because they looked at all the other options, and it was just going to be way more trouble for various reasons. And so he went in and had that surgery last week. He's out, he's fine, he's home, he's recovering, life is good.
Wonderful.
But he came to coffee the week before the surgery and was telling people this story. And he was at one end of the table and his wife was at the other end because this is a gender-segregated coffee gathering, which is not something that is in my control, but they've been doing this for years and nobody's going to stop them. But somebody at his end of the table asked, so, hey, does that mean you have to go looking for a new wife if you're losing a rib? And he said, no, why would I want to? And it was very sweet, but also like they managed to make a Bible joke out of nothing. And it wasn't, mean-spirited. I love that. And so his wife said he actually made a point of telling her later that she was wonderful and he was so grateful to have her because of that. But yeah, I thought that was a great story. And also, bodies are interesting and do the strangest things.
It's true. They really, really do. Yeah. Interesting. That's really sweet. I love that.
You never know what you'll get on Nerds at Church.
It's true. So, Adam and Eve, they were born in the beginning, in those early times, in the Garden of Eden. They died. We don't actually know all of this information. We know that they died outside of the Garden of Eden, presumably east of it, because that's where God put up the sentry to, guard from them getting back in. And we know that Adam died at 930 years old, and Eve's death is not recorded in Genesis, so we don't actually know. They had at least 4 kids. They had Cain and Abel, which did not end well, and then they had Seth as their 3rd kid, and continued to have kids, and, right. All of that stuff.
Also, I feel like we should mention that we as a podcast do not necessarily hold that Adam and Eve were historical personages, and
yes,
that this is a storytelling method. But
yes. This is what I think of as a creation story.
And Jewish people agree with us, so.
Yes. There are actually multiple creation stories in the Bible and even in the beginning of Genesis. And they are not intended to tell us the historical facts of how we came to be. They don't answer those questions. Those are questions that a lot of times science can answer. You can check out our Big Bang episode from season 1 for the second Sunday of Christmas, where we talk about the Big Bang with Dr. David Cordall. And so when we think about it, we're not thinking about the how creation came to be or even the when of creation, but we're thinking why. What is the purpose of creation? And so that's what this story of creation really seeks to answer, is why were humans created? Why did we come about? Why is the world the way that it is? Just like with creation myths from all different cultures. So this is just one snippet of it. And If we try to make it historical fact, A, that's not great for our faith because it's not reflective of reality. But also it loses some of the meaning because things don't have to be historically factual in order to be truthful. They can tell truths about us and about the world we live in without being historically factual. So, what are they known for? A lot of things. Adam and Eve and Steve are known for a lot of things. They're known for being the first humans, as we mentioned in that particular story. They're known for eating a fruit, a forbidden fruit. Some say it might be a pomegranate. We don't actually know what type of fruit it is. And they're known for blaming someone else for what they do and for birthing humanity outside of the Garden of Eden. And the main kind of chunk of story that we're specifically focusing on for today's episode is Genesis chapter 3, verses 8 through 21, where having eaten of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the first humans hide from God because they now feel shame for being naked. When God finds and confronts them, Adam blames Eve and Eve blames the serpent for their new predicament. So this story is so pervasive in pop culture. It is everywhere, and people think they know what this story is and what it's about. But like with, the book of Revelation, maybe, there's a lot to this story that gets missed because it is told again and again in pop culture settings and not necessarily read from the actual text.
And those folks don't always know what they're talking about when they retell it.
It's true. So one of the things that I always have emphasized when I've talked about or taught about this story is the thing that happens in the story. They eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So they know things. And yes, God told the original human not to do that. God did not specifically say it to Eve, and it's debatable if God said it to Adam because of how the human became multiple humans.
Yes.
So there's a limit to the extent to which Eve especially, but also Adam, know what the rules are around the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the serpent has its own agenda, right? It's trying to provoke, to cause questioning and to inspire doubt and wonder and curiosity.
And break relationships.
Yeah, and it does so. And so one of the things that's really cool that we don't talk about a lot is that Eve is the first person in the Bible to have a theological conversation. Mm-hmm. Eve and the serpent have a theological discussion about what God said about the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, about what God's desires and commands were. And one of the other things that is glossed over a lot is that Adam seems to be present for this. He's just not talking, which some of us say is, man's rightful place, standing aside and not talking. Don't hate me. In pop culture, in this story, Eve does this thing that's evil and then somehow seduces Adam into also eating the fruit. But in the biblical text, the serpent and Eve have this conversation. Eve takes a bite, eats the fruit, and hands it to Adam, who has been there the whole time, and Adam eats it. It is not a seduction. It is not a trickery. It is not, in fact, Snow White and the poisoned apple.
Right.
It's just a, hey, fruit, here, fruit. And so I think that's really important. And the thing that for me is the problematic part is not even necessarily that they eat the fruit, but it is what happens after, right? God comes to them and they hide from God. And then when God is like, why are you hiding from me?
Because that's never happened before.
Right. Adam says, Eve made me do it. And Eve says, the serpent made me do it. And it is this propensity that we have. And this is why when this came up in the lectionary, we talked about blame, shame, and vulnerability. This propensity that we as humans have to blame someone else for the things that we have done.
Yeah.
And so that's where, like, the villainy and where we say Eve seduced Adam comes from this Adam blaming Eve thing.
Yeah.
But then Eve does it to the serpent. Right? So it's not just one or the other. It is that these first humans don't take responsibility for their actions. They don't take responsibility for the things that they do that God said, hey, don't do this.
So would that be the original sin?
I think so.
Yeah.
That is my perspective on original, quote-unquote, original sin, as they say. And I love that in the story itself, I love that Eve is the first person in the Bible to have a theological conversation. And that Adam just sits by silently. But I also love that there is this sense of when we blame someone else, we cause harm. When we are unable to take responsibility for our own actions, we cause harm. And I am not perfect. You can ask my family. I am not great at this. But it's something that I try for. Right? It's something that we constantly get to try for to be better at taking responsibility for our actions.
Right.
So I really love that.
There are a couple other things I would like to take a moment to point out because I found these about this story and I love them. One is that I can't give you a verse reference because I don't remember, but a couple of years ago I gave a sermon in which I pointed out that somewhere in one of the lectionary texts from a letter that Paul wrote, not just a letter attested to Paul, but one that he actually would have written, he places the blame squarely on Adam's shoulders. I know this because I made a joke about it in a sermon about 2 years ago, but I don't actually remember which Bible passage it was, so I'm sorry I can't give you a verse reference. But in about a year or so, keep an eye on the lectionary epistle readings, and it'll come back up again. And so I'm sure we'll see that again
I know
soon.
what you're talking about. I know what you're talking about. I can't remember it, though. Yeah.
Because, Paul was a very educated scholar in biblical scholarship at the time, and he would have been very thoroughly educated in the background and the language and everything. And so if anyone would know, he would. And he would tell you that at great volume and at great length. So he is presumably an expert, and he places the blame squarely on Adam. Another thing that I found interesting, just as I was rereading this story for our episode today, is that Eve does not actually get named until the very end, after everything else has happened. Adam names her at the very end. And I think it's interesting that she went through this whole story without a name, but Adam didn't. I don't know what that means, or it seems significant. Was she not the person to him, or did he not fully understand her until they went through this together? I don't know. But she's named Eve because she's the mother of creation. And that isn't about what happened. That isn't about original sin. That's not about anything being her fault. And then finally, I feel like we've been making a joke through a decent chunk of this episode now that we haven't explained, just in case anyone is actually young enough to not recognize it. But when we say Adam and Eve and Steve, it's because there used to be a homophobic reaction to people talking about homosexual relationships, where people would say, it's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And, Steve has done nothing wrong. Steve is the only person who's not a villain in this episode.
It's true.
Steve is just fine. Steve is just hanging out and living his life. And so I think we need to not blame him for any of this.
It's true. It's true. Also, I was thinking about it, and this comes out in media a lot, but the character person of Lilith, who is thought to be Adam's first wife, but was sexually liberated and so now has become villainized, which goes in so well with our themes.
There is a whole medieval subtrope of why women shouldn't be on top during sex because of Lilith, and it is hilarious to read about, but yeah.
Yeah. My favorite 6-year-old is named Lilith, so I just think it's always hilarious. But Lilith also comes up in True Blood, in The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, in Frasier, in The Fifth Element. So many different places where she comes up, and I think it's just fascinating. Also, I figured out the passage that you were talking about.
Oh, good.
It is the first Sunday in Lent in year A.
Okay.
And the Hebrew Bible reading is Genesis 2:15 through 17 and 3:1 through 7. So it has this conversation that we're talking about with the serpent that happens right before the passage that we're linking to. Romans 5:12 through 19. And Romans 5:12 says, therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin, and so death spread to all because all have sinned. So there's more to it, obviously, but that particular part it comes back to that a couple times, that sin, presumably, according to Paul, entered the world through Adam. And so, again, another connection. Dun, dun, dun.
Sure.
Another tie-in to today's theme. Yeah, and so there's actually a lot of media that is connected to Adam and Eve. There are a couple books. The first is Approaching Eden, Adam and Eve in Pop Culture by Teresa Sanders. I've not read it, but it seemed fascinating.
Sure.
It's just like a tour of when Adam and Eve show up in pop culture. But Approaching Eden sounds like a really cool book that I would be fascinated to engage with. Also, Eve is one of the characters in WALL-E, and while WALL-E has super fat phobic stuff, there's also this sense of caring for creation and new starts that Adam and Eve are, like, that is part of the trope.
Yeah.
If you go to TV tropes of Adam and Eve, is new starts, new creation, new chances for usually humanity, but in this case, 2 random robots who are adorable. Also, Snow White has the connection to Adam and Eve through the apple, which it probably wasn't an apple, but a lot of white Western Christianity has decided it is an apple, even though it was more likely a pomegranate or something like that. Also, there is a TV thriller called Killing Eve, which has Sandra Oh in it, and Jodie Comer, who I don't really know. So that I have not seen, but sounds fascinating, and is another connection to Eve, as well as Good Omens. I think you said it, right?
Yes. There is a bit in the book and also a bit in the miniseries about how one of the main characters, Aziraphale, was actually the angel that gave the flaming sword to Adam on their way out of the garden.
Ah, okay. And then there are a bunch of movies like my favorite, Interstellar, that have the trope of going to a new place to restart humanity, to give new birth, new life to humanity in a place. And so Interstellar is one of them, but there are many, many others.
Yeah. I also feel like I should mention the character Lilith in Frasier. That's just his ex-wife. Like, she's not actually the personification of Lilith, although he does make a couple of jokes about that. But yeah,
mostly those references were just like the name references, but yeah, Thank you for clarifying.
Okay. And then our central set of villains for today are the Earth Liberation Front and the Weathermen, or the Weather Underground. And so we can start off by giving you some basic information for both of them. The Weathermen, or the Weather Underground, was founded in 1969 in Ann Arbor, Michigan. It was named after a line in a Bob Dylan song, something like, "You don't need a weatherman to tell which way the wind is blowing." And they considered themselves sort of the white counterpart to the Black Panther movement, moving in similar directions and doing similar things, and focused primarily on combating American imperialism, and because of the time that they were mostly active, also protesting the Vietnam War.
Indeed. The Environmental Life Force, or the ELVs, ELF, get it? Mm-hmm. Was founded in 1977 in Santa Cruz, California. And their initial focus was on fighting the use of dangerous pesticides. Later on, they moved to wider guerrilla warfare against the destruction of the environment. And the initial founder of ELF, or the ELVs, since has stated that he did more good for the environment through his research and organizing than through the guerrilla warfare that the organization did. And this group no longer exists. In the 90s, a group called Earth Liberation Force surfaced in the UK, but other than having similar names to the first group, there's not really a connection. And they use a leaderless resistance model to fight environmental destruction by way of property damage, which is not a little bit ironic.
Yeah.
More on that to come.
So what are they known for? Well, the basic background story of the Weather Underground. They were most noticeably active from 1969 to 1973. Their first incident was destroying a statue in Chicago which commemorated the deaths of 7 police officers at what was known as the Haymarket Affair. I realize that people who didn't grow up near Chicago have probably never heard of the Haymarket Affair, so I'm going to give you the very brief rundown, which is that it began as a peaceful rally one day in 1886 for a 8-hour workday. And this rally happened because there had very recently, I believe the day before, been an accident at a factory which had killed 1 worker and injured several others. And so police arrived at this peaceful rally and tried to disperse the crowds, and someone unknown threw a bomb. And because of the bomb, 7 policemen and 4 civilians were killed. A lot more people were injured. It was an absolute nightmare. More frustratingly, although not really a surprise to anyone who spent time in Chicago, those who were accused at the trial that happened subsequently were only vaguely connected to the incident. Like, one of the people might have been the person to build the bomb, but 2 of the people weren't even in town when this incident happened. No one was actually the person accused of throwing the bomb. They never found that person, and several of the people were only vaguely connected at all. Back in 1969, the Weathermen destroyed this statue that commemorated the deaths of those 7 policemen. The statue did not have anything to do with the dead civilians, by the way. And so after the Weathermen destroyed the statue, the city put it back up. And so the Weathermen destroyed it again. And then the city put it back up. And then the Weathermen destroyed it a 3rd time. And then the city decided to rebuild the statue at police headquarters. This was really only the initial, this happened over the course of a couple of years, I think, and this was really only the initial thing that the Weathermen were known for, and I realized that it probably was incredibly scary for the residents of Chicago at the time, because, among other things, the first blast apparently blew out over 100 windows in the neighborhood. Anytime you're dealing with explosives in a crowded city, that's going to scare some people.
Yeah.
There were no serious injuries or deaths regarding those blasts, as far as I know. But when you're reading the story of what happened with the statue, it has very strong, and then that fell into the swamp, Monty Python energy about it. Yeah, I do not love what they did, but wow, that's one heck of a story about a statue. And so later that October, still in 1969, the Weathermen held a rally against the Vietnam War, again in Chicago, that turned into a few hundred people rioting in the affluent Gold Coast neighborhood, which is basically where the rich people live in Chicago, still is. And then a couple days later, they held a march in the Loop, which is what's the center of Chicago's downtown is called. It's basically the most crowded part of the city. That march ended similarly to the rally that happened a few days before. Lots of rioting and destruction. They continued to operate underground, and they were responsible for a few arson attacks in New York City before there was an explosion due to a bomb-making accident at a Greenwich Village townhouse in March of 1970. That explosion killed 3 of the members, 2 others escaped unharmed. And this incident shook the organization deeply, and they shrank a very significant amount after that. After that story, the incidents get more sporadic. They set off a bomb at the New York City Police Department. They broke a drug activist out of prison and got him to Algeria. They set off a bomb at the U.S. Senate, and then another one in a women's bathroom at the Pentagon. I really want to ask someone why the women's bathroom, but I just assume that's what they had access to. I don't know.
Yeah.
I assume it wasn't the women's bathroom in particular they were angry about. And as a group, they did make an effort to be careful to not hurt anyone in their explosions, to make sure that people were not harmed. But there really is only so careful you can be when you're dealing with explosives in crowded public areas and crowded cities. Gracious, a lot of people could have died. And they were also a part of the COINTELPRO investigations, which could probably be a whole nother podcast episode, so I'm not going into that in any detail. But eventually what happened was that several leaders of the group published a manifesto called Prairie Fire in 1974. You can still find that in various places. And after the publication of the manifesto, the organization essentially dissolved into a couple of separate groups with different goals, and it's not really a thing anymore.
Yeah. Oof. Yeah. So it's interesting because we're talking about organizations that have not survived in certain ways.
Right. And, bombs are bad. And on the other hand, I am totally against American imperialism, and if I were alive back then, I would have been against the Vietnam War. But also, explosions in the middle of crowded cities are a terrible idea for so many reasons. And, even just a window that gets blown out can kill someone. So,
yeah. Well, and that's the tricky part of property damage is not the same as human damage, right? Violence against humans and violence against property are 2 very, very, very different things.
Yeah, no, I'm less concerned about the property damage, but sometimes the property damage can lead to human damage.
But what I'm saying is, when we think about protests after Mike Brown was killed by police, right? Or George Floyd, the property damage is the thing that gets people riled up. When in reality, property damage is not actually harming many people, because if it's a business, it has insurance, most likely, to pay for the repairs. And homes have insurance. And property damage is much more a violence against capitalism than a violence against humans, but we portray
I would also point out that there is a difference between breaking a window with a crowbar and breaking a window with a bomb.
Yes.
In terms of the potential for terrible things happening. So, I think we're agreeing with each other, but in a slightly different avenue of
I'm
conversation.
taking this and kind of extrapolating. So we, as a culture, have gotten, up in arms, literally, thank you, but not thank you, about damage that is done to properties, to businesses, that sort of thing.
And that's been going on since the 1880s, as we now have proof from the Haymarket Affair.
But we don't do that in the same way for damage and violence done to humans, particularly if it's at the hands of the state. And I think it's particularly interesting, right? And we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, of that, there are different levels to violence. There is the violence against property and there is violence against humans, but there's also this deeper level of violence that is economic violence and resource violence and all of these other systems that harm people. And it is just fascinating to me that so many of the protests against humans being killed, usually by police, the thing that the media latches onto, the thing that police stories latch onto, is the violence against buildings and property. And that in and of itself says something, right? Because it's not violence against people. The response to violence against a human is not more violence against humans. It's violence against property. It's violence against the systems that are set up to harm us all. But we put it at the same level. And a black boy's life is not the same as a gas station's ability to function. Not at all. Yeah. Anywho, so knowing and recognizing that, one of the things that the Earth Liberation Front is most well known for, well, in my world is most well known for, is October 19th, 1998, in Vail, Colorado, which is where I am originally from. They set fire to Two Elk, which was basically 3 buildings, and then also 4 chairlifts at the top of Vail Mountain, which is the biggest ski resort in North America. And the eco-terrorist group was called The Family, but they were associated with the Earth Liberation Front. And what I think is fascinating about this in particular, and this is where the villainy comes in, right? Because their goal was to protest the expansion of Vail, because there was a proposal that was in progress to expand Vail Mountain. And there were a lot of protests, actually, particularly about the ways that it could endanger lynx habitat. And so, like, in the midst of a controversial thing that didn't have the full backing of the town, Earth Liberation Front came in, destroyed buildings and chairlifts, which takes resources, and then that actually, like, became a rallying thing for people in town. I was a kid at the time, but for people in town to then be like, no, we are supporting this. We're not with the eco-terrorists, we're supporting this. And so it had, in so many ways, the opposite effect. It used more resources to rebuild those things, because Vail rebuilt those things. But then it also actually, like, strengthened the push to expand Vail Mountain and the ski resort instead of pushing against it.
It turns out terrorism makes people angry. Huh.
I think that that's really interesting. And for a long time, we didn't know who actually was responsible for it. And then eventually 6 people were tried and incarcerated. And a 7th person who is suspected to be the 7th person involved was in Spain, last Wikipedia heard, and remains on the FBI's most wanted list. But they didn't kill anybody. There were a couple hunters who were in the heated bathrooms, which sometimes hunters sleep in there, I guess. But they were okay. They didn't kill anybody. They just damaged property. And so that's part of where I was coming from, of like how much our culture, and particularly like our government and our law enforcement, has valued property. And I was thinking about it particularly because a woman in Iowa, Jessica Resnicek, was sentenced while I was in Iowa, June 30th, 2021. She was a water protector and tampered with and harmed some of the energy stuff that was involved with the Dakota Access Pipeline. And she was sentenced to 8 years in prison and 3 years of probation and $3.2 million in restitution in Iowa for nonviolent actions against the Dakota Access Pipeline in 2017. And the thing about her sentence was that the judge decided to add a domestic terrorism enhancement to it because she was harming an energy plant.
Sure.
And that particular enhancement is from the Patriot Act, which was in response to the attacks on 9/11, and that the Biden administration started to use to combat domestic terror. And so the federal judge applied that to hers, and so she has a much longer sentence than most people who do what she did and get found guilty or charged for what she did. Yeah. And so again and again, the themes, right, are folks who have good goals and good aims and want to do something, and then the results are not as good as they're hoping, or the results and the particularly like backlash, especially from the government, especially from police, that sort of thing, against their actions would just make things worse.
Yeah.
And don't actually help. So that's fascinating to me. Also, eco-terrorism, but also just environmentalism in general. Part of why we chose these is because I am just fascinated with what happened at Two Elk, and mostly because I was really excited to talk about Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze as maybe not the villains we think they are.
They are interesting, yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's important for us to know that we can't just categorize people as hero or villain.
The world is more complicated than that.
Yep. That there is nuance and there is complexity in how we characterize people and organizations and actions that people take. The one place where I will, carve out a caveat for us is ecofascism is still fascism. So if you are advocating for environmental concerns in a way that advocates for the genocide of people who are not white, that's called fascism. And that's still wrong. That's super duper wrong. And there's a difference between advocating for, like, let's have fewer kids, and advocating for, let's make Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have fewer kids. Right? Not the same thing.
Yeah, we wanted to throw in that note because if you're looking for a group to get involved with environmental activism, you really want to take a careful look about whether or not they are tied to eco-fascists these days. It is impressive how intertwined they have gotten with a lot of very popular groups.
Yeah. It's almost like a lot of environmental organizations were predominantly white and didn't deal with racism.
Yeah. Funny how that works.
Which also, right, if you are looking to get involved with environmental concerns and environmental organizing in your community, finding organizations that are led by Black, Indigenous, and other people of color is the best way to do that because A, they're automatically not fascist, and B, those are the people who are most impacted by environmental degradation, climate change, and other things that we are trying to work against. So
they also tend to know how to get things done without causing unexpected problems because they've been there.
Indeed they do and have. Yeah.
So what do we love about these villains?
Indeed.
I have to say that, like I said earlier, working against American imperialism and environmental destruction are good. I'm still pointing out that explosions, as much as you all know that I love fire very, very much, explosions are bad. No matter how careful you are, fire and explosions can get out of control very, very fast. Please be careful. And don't use them to, fight for your various causes. Unless you're just, like, having a little campfire while you chat with friends, and in that case, just make sure you actually put it out all the way at the end. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Smokey the Bear will be proud of you.
Indeed. I love that they are actually willing to take a risk. Yeah. I think about Jessica Reznicek in particular, but in general, that there is a very clear seriousness with the things that they are risking, whether we're talking about environmental, like the seriousness of climate change and the ways that climate change will kill us all, literally, or the risks that people like Mr. Freeze, right? That Mr. Freeze is willing to take this huge risk for the love of his wife. That Poison Ivy is literally the earth fighting back. I love those things.
Yeah. So these folks kind of created our theme for today because this was, I think, where we started, and then we came into Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze. So.
Yeah, I can't remember because Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze are so integral to me.
Yeah.
To the villain era. Yeah. So, speaking of tie-ins to today's theme, obviously, both organizations have a claim of trying to do the right thing, and of wanting to do the right thing, of wanting to protect the environment, of wanting to work against climate change and decrease climate change. And yet, the impact of what they've done is more questionable. Certainly, for Vail, Colorado, it did not have the effect that they wanted it to have and had a reverse effect. Yeah, that's the tricky part of life, is we do things, and even when we do them for the right reasons or for good reasons, that doesn't mean that they won't cause harm.
Yeah. So as for media tie-ins, for the Weather Underground, I always feel like I have to mention this first. There is an unrelated weather service called Weather Underground, which just tells you about the weather. It is not related to the weathermen. It is not related, as far as I'm aware, to ecoterrorism or to terrorism regarding American imperialism. They just had really horrible taste in picking a name, I guess. Or maybe they just were young enough that they didn't know about it. I don't know. But as far as I know, there's no relation there. I stopped using their app because they couldn't give me accurate data about tornadoes in my neighborhood, so I haven't used them for a while.
That seems kind of important.
It Yes, that is actually the primary goal of me having a weather app in the first place. So I do have a handful of memoirs from those who were directly involved. There's Fugitive Days, Memoirs of an Anti-War Activist by Bill Ayers, who was one of the formative members, and also Flying Close to the Sun, My Life and Times as a Weatherman by Kathy Wilkerson, who was one of those people who survived the townhouse explosion in New York. And those were both published in the 2000s. And Sing a Battle Song is a collection of songs and poetry published by the leadership as a group, which was also in the 2000s. There's a book called Bad Moon Rising, How the Weather Underground Beat the FBI and Lost the Revolution. That's by a historian, and it was published in 2016, and I believe it gets good reviews. And then also, if you're looking for a movie to watch instead of a book to read, there is a documentary called The Weather Underground, made in 2002, and it gets excellent reviews as far as historicity is involved. So that is available in various places. And of course, if you want to read the government paperwork, the government subcommittee reports on the group are, I believe, public domain, and you can go looking for those. Have fun. I'm sure they make for delightful reading.
I'm sure they do. As for the Elves, the Earth Liberation Front, the book that really got me deeper into this, because 1998, I was 12, right? I was not at an age where I really knew what was going on. I remember it, but I didn't really know what was going on. And then several years ago, I think during our previous iteration of the podcast, when I was still living in Minnesota, I did a reading challenge, and one of the categories was read a book based on where you're from, your hometown. And so I read Powder Burn, Arson, Money, and Mystery on Vail Mountain by Dan Glick. And it goes into the details of the lynx habitat, the arson, the politics that had been brewing before the arson, before the ecoterrorism, and what happened after and all of that. Shortly after that was published, they actually figured out who had done it and brought them to trial. So it was really interesting because I didn't know, because I hadn't been that connected to that later on. Sure. And so I was reading it and I was like, I wonder who it is. Like, these are all the different pieces that, like, could have had a hand in it. And then after it was over, I was talking to my mom and she was like, yeah, they found the people. And then the other book that I found that looked like it would be really interesting was Burning Rage of a Dying Planet, Speaking for the Earth Liberation Front by Craig Rosebraugh. And I think both of those would be probably really good reads. Also, if you just want to get involved in environmental stuff in a larger scope, the Sunrise Movement is youth-led climate change organizing.
Not blowing things up?
And not necessarily blowing things up. And they are all over the country, for sure, and would be a great way to get involved.
And then as for other themes that tie in with our villains for today, I don't know that I can put this precisely into words, but especially regarding Poison Ivy, Mr. Freeze, and to an extent Adam and Eve with all the finger pointing, and I don't have enough personal experience with the historical groups we talked about, but there's a sense of, well, if I don't get what I want, then neither will anyone else. And there's sort of a whiny, childish reaction involved in there of, you know, it's not me, it's not my problem, what I'm doing is not the problem. That does hit for Adam and Eve with all the finger pointing, and does at various points, depending on the continuity, hit for Poison Ivy and Mr. Freeze as well. They do occasionally have pointed out to them that they could have taken other less murdery options. And there's a phrase a British acquaintance of mine used. She's died a few years ago, but she called it the toys out of pram reaction, where, like, if a toddler throws away a toy that they love because they are angry about something else. It just, that's what strikes me about a lot of this stuff is...
That makes me think of the times when Athena is just like,
animals can definitely do that too.
Not living her best life, or like resisting going to sleep or whatever, and so she takes like the cuddle stuffy that we have for her that has like a heartbeat, and she just grabs it and she like flings it around, and then eventually she settles down with it and then snuggles with it for the night. But yeah,
I really love the phrase toys out of pram. It sums all that up so nicely.
Yep. And the other theme that we've talked about a bunch is environmentalism. The research is out there. The science is there. It is clear the climate is changing, and it already is harming us and will continue to harm us even more if we don't stop things.
And don't refuse to do anything about it just because a few people blew some things up once. Like, that's not helpful either.
Yeah, but, like, there's this sense of urgency, right? There's an urgency to what is happening in the world that is very palpable in eco-terrorists, but also is just, like, when we think about environmental stuff, there is so much that leads us individually to be paralyzed, and what we actually need is collective action, because the changes that we need are primarily changes to corporations and oversight of organizations and to the way that we fund things and all of that stuff to help it be better for the environment. So, yeah. And now for our Muppets Moment. So, okay. Which Muppet would you cast for which villain?
So I was thinking about Adam and Eve, and Adam and the rib, and Adam and the apple, and all that, and it strikes me that Adam might actually find having a knife on hand useful. So can we cast the Swedish chef as Adam? Because, like, I think that we're also not really supposed to understand a lot of what he says. Like, he seems like a character who talks to God, but only God can understand him. And so I think that works for the Swedish chef. I mean, he'd have to, like, okay, now I have this lovely image of Adam initially in the garden, and of course he's still wearing the chef's apron and the chef hat, because he is a chef, by golly, but he wouldn't necessarily have to be wearing anything else as the garden starts out, but then later, of course, he adds the shirt and pants underneath.
I love that. I love that. Oh my gosh, that's so good. I was thinking about Poison Ivy. I was stuck on Poison Ivy, and I think Miss Piggy could do it. Because she's Miss Piggy, and she can do just about anything.
I think they'd be best friends.
Right. But I just keep thinking of... Yeah, this is kind of ridiculous, but I just keep thinking of Slimy, Oscar the Grouch's pet worm, on Sesame Street.
Again, you're gonna love Harley Quinn. She has a pet plant whose name is Frank. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going for Slimy. Because why not?
And if we're going to cast Mr. Freeze, you know who's the right color for that? Sam Eagle. And wouldn't he have a grand old time being Mr. Freeze the same way that Arnold Schwarzenegger was in 1997? He would love that character so much. That would be great. I don't know who on earth would marry him and be Nora, but aside from that, it could be very fun.
That is more compelling than I wanted it to be. I wanted to dismiss it as like, yeah, he's the same color. But then you went Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then
he would love the cryo suit.
Okay, now I can see it. I can see it in my head.
And, like, instead of being dedicated to America, he'd be dedicated to his wife.
Yeah.
It could be very sweet, really. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Here I am, ruining Emily's conception of Muppets. So, thanks for joining us. Our theme music was by Rachel Meyer-Laughlin, our Muppets music was by Brenda Boss, and our seasonal artwork was by Pace Warfield. Catch us next time when we'll dive into John Brown and more. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Rohloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and Blue Sky at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut episodes, merch discounts, movie commentaries, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. Starting at just $5 per month, it is infinitely cheaper than any domestic or international terrorism you may be contemplating.
And again, please don't. Murder bad. So, also let us know on Blue Sky, Facebook, or Twitter which Muppet would you cast for which character in our episode today.
As the ancient Christians said,
Pax Vobiscum.